Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to S&C Coaches React. Today we're doing Fred Kerley or Frederick Lee Kerley. He is one of three men to only go sub 10 seconds in the 100 meter, sub 20 seconds in the 200 meter, sub 44 seconds in the 400 meter. He started out as a 400 meter runner, then he changed to the 200 meter and the 100 meter. Personal best of 9.76 in the 100 meter. He's won several medals at World Championships, relay in the 400 meter. His personal best in the 400 meter is 43.64. Fred is 6'3" and listed as 93 kilos here. So Frederick is, I think you could say, pretty fast.
Yeah, I think it was a bold move moving down to the 100s and 200s, but clearly it paid off very, very well.
Now, before we get going, I do think it is very important just to say this all the time, because sometimes these comments do come up, especially if the video gets a little bit bigger, is that this isn't a hit piece or a recommendation piece for Frederick. We are simply just looking at his videos and taking them into some context for you as an athlete or you as a coach, so you might get some information and some thoughts on how you could apply that to your own training. This isn't a recommendation for Frederick to go and do this for his training, and this is not some kind of advertisement piece for that. So this is for people who don't have elite coaches or elite international coaches like Frederick might. So we want to pass that information along and some things we've learned and how this might impact your own training, and in this case someone between the 100, 200 and 400 meter sprinting. And I just hit the mic twice there, so that must be pretty annoying. First up, we've got some classic PAP.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, we have the use of a hex bar deadlift straight into a kind of counter movement jump, kind of squat jump. Now, PAP, as Gerf just called it, is post-activation potentiation. So basically, in general terms, what we get is a bigger lift, usually bipedal, so using both legs. Big lift, putting a lot of force through their central and peripheral nervous system, then going into something that's more explosive, more speed-based, usually some sort of stretch shortening cycle being used there again. Now, what we see in post-activation potentiation is we see when the big heavy lift is done first, we usually get a small uptick in performance in the explosive exercise being done straight away after. Now, when we look at the training of faster movements, more explosive movements, more power-based movement, usually what we see is the faster we can move in training, or the higher we can jump in training, the better the outcomes are. So what we're usually seeing here is we see some sort of facilitator. In this case, it's a hex bar deadlift, or later on we'll see a front squat being used in the very same way, and then we get a small or minor uptick in the performance of the vertical jump afterwards. Now, you can see this being used with sprinters, you can see it being used with field sports athletes, you can see it being used with the jump, with the sprint, with anything really that's incredibly explosive. You also see some athletes doing it with very heavy bench presses, and then they'll go on to something like a clap push-up or a very dynamic plyo med ball press or something along those lines. Now, in this case, the use of a hex bar is really applicable for a track and field athlete. The hex bar is a kind of bastardized or hybridized version, going somewhere between a squat and somewhere between a deadlift. What it allows us to do, though, is it allows us to weight the athlete very heavily. So in the case of this, it's multiple plates. It's probably around 140 or 150 kilos, depending on the weight of the hex bar implement itself. And then if we were to do that with something like a straight bar deadlift, oftentimes an athlete who is not a strength sports athlete, when we start weighting them with the standard strength sport implements, they might lose position, they might be at a greater risk of injury, and the hex bar just mitigates some of that risk. Now, the other interesting side of this is when we see him doing his counter movement jump, or what I phrased earlier as almost a counter movement jump, almost a squat jump, we see him reaching down and touching the floor. Now, it's interesting, we'll see this constraint being put on some jumps sometimes. What we're really doing is we're getting a very consistent depth of that dip and drive for the jump. So usually with a classic counter movement jump, we'll see a big arm swing, we'll see someone dipping down to a self-selected depth, and then they'll jump up as high as they possibly can, getting some benefit from the swing of the arms, but mainly getting a benefit from that self-selected depth. So that's the optimum amount of stretch for the muscle tendon unit to be going through for them to jump as high as possible. Now, we can only speculate why they might be selecting a depth for him to dip through. Maybe it's the certain range of motion that coach wants him to go through. Maybe he wants him to be using that swing or that driving with the arms a small bit less. But all the same, it's interesting to see him using that, dipping down and touching the floor. It's very possible when we see this being used for athletes, it's that the dip and drive in their classic counter movement jump isn't quite deep enough, and the coach wants them to dip and drive a bit more, get a small bit more force put through the legs, and hopefully get better strength outcomes and power outcomes because of that.
So one of the next things we can see appearing very, very frequently throughout his training history, and Fred uploads pretty regular training clips over the years from his S&C work, and the thing we'll see very frequently is a lot of isolation work. And this is a very interesting thing. We'll see lots of upper body isolation work. In one of the clips here, we'll see chest press, and then he goes into upright rows, then he goes into tricep extensions. We'll see things like quad extensions, we'll see things like pull-ups. A lot of this is very frequently throughout his training, and we can see this very, very consistently. So one of the interesting things about sprinting and jumping is we're always looking for that correct body composition and this body weight, how much fat mass we have, how much lean mass we have. And in some cases, it's as easy a recommendation to say that we want to be as big and as lean as possible, specifically when we're in a weight class sport, for example. So if maybe we're a jiu-jitsu athlete or we're a boxer and we're a lighter individual, maybe we're in our 70 kilos or maybe even the 80 kilo range, something like that, doesn't matter. The recommendation is we want to be as lean as sustainable. We want to have as much muscle mass because that's what's doing as much of that work as possible. So enough fat mass to sustain living and be healthy and have regular hormonal activities and at a caloric consumption that lets us live normally, where we're hitting lots of our micronutrients. And then of course then we're filling out the rest of that with muscle mass. Now for runners, sprinters, hurdlers, this is a very different case. Sprinting in particular is even more individual to that person. So Frederick is 6'3", 93 kilos. And his body composition for someone who might be shorter, might be 5'10", 5'11", is going to have a vastly different physique at a similar weight. So we did Johan Blake a couple of weeks ago, and we can see his body composition is quite similar to someone who is maybe an amateur bodybuilder, whereas Frederick is heavier, but his body composition looks a lot different. So this really comes down to individual nuance and you paying attention to what your results are, how you feel, how your performance is. But one of the things there is that he's not ignoring that upper body and he's trying to build lean tissue. And one of the interesting ways he's doing that is supersets. Now, if you've ever run a Sika Strength program, maybe you've the Sika Strength app, you'll see supersets appearing quite frequently from all the way from our Olympic weightlifters to our powerlifters to any of the athlete programs. And it's a very efficient way of going about training. Now, if we were an entirely physique-based athlete, we'd be looking for that last 1 to 2, 3% of hypertrophy that we might get from straight sets and focusing entirely on that exercise. Supersetting, we might get a bit more fatigue across those sessions. We're a little bit more fatigued in that 10-minute time frame, so we mightn't get as perfect technique, we mightn't get as much weight. But when it comes to athletes, lots of athletes don't particularly want to be in the gym for that long. They don't want to be doing their S&C for hours on end. They don't want to do 6 sets of chest press with a dumbbell or Smith machine that takes them 30 minutes. They don't want to be there. Lots of athletes don't really care that much. They want to get in, get out, get their job done. They know they need to do it, but they don't particularly want to do it. And superset is a great way of just being efficient with that time in the gym. You can do supersets in a couple of different manners. You can do opposing muscle groups. We can do upper and lower body. We can do several similar groups. So in this case, he's doing chest press, tricep extension, and upright rows. So a big turnover, a big kind of a cover of similar muscle groups. So we're getting shoulders and tricep and chest involved in a lot of these exercises, but it doesn't really matter. So we look at social media. If we look at bodybuilding focused and physique focused educators and experts, we'll have a lot of argument around a little bit of nuance where we're seeing minor percentages, like several grams of difference in lean tissue building over the course of several months. And in their case, that is important and is relevant. But when it comes to athletes, we just don't care that much about that minor difference. Realistically, we want better quality sessions, more efficient sessions, and usually it's really not going to make a major difference. So supersets are a great way of being more efficient in the gym and occupying that athlete a little bit more closely and getting things done a little bit faster. I know I personally prefer supersets when I'm doing my hypertrophy and assistance work, because it's just kind of boring sometimes doing straight sets of isolation work, especially if you're a strength athlete who's used to bigger lifts. or if you're a runner who's happier on the track or on the pitch or doing your sport, supersets are a great way of just getting it done, especially if you're time restricted. And sometimes there's a lot of benefit to just spending a little bit less time in that gym. The longer we're in the gym, the more we're lifting, the higher we're elevating stress hormones like cortisol. We're using up a little bit more energy just being in a heightened state. And sometimes it's better just to condense us down and get out of the gym a bit faster.
Up next then, we have some kettlebell swings. Now, kettlebell swings are a major talking point in the world of S&C, in the world of functional training, but mainly in the world of amateur non-sports athletes. So people who go to the gym a lot like doing kettlebell swings, particularly in the functional training or the kind of general readiness area of training. Now, kettlebells have a fantastic application for field sports athletes, track and field athletes, power athletes, strength athletes even. The kettlebell swing, the standard Russian swing to eye level, is absolutely a great training tool. But oftentimes we tend to lose the nuance of why a kettlebell swing might be more beneficial than a deadlift, or why it might have a lower barrier for entry than something like a power clean. So when we look at the kettlebell swing, what we're doing is we're really activating the posterior chain quite well. We get some anterior chain work as well with the lower body, particularly the quads at the very end of the swing. But the most important part of a kettlebell swing is that the kettlebell swing is an accelerated movement. So it's not like a deadlift. When we are typically doing a deadlift, as long as it's not a clean pull or a snatch pull or something along those lines, the barbell generally gets slower as it approaches our hip. So off the floor, it will move quite quickly. It might accelerate all the way through the first pull, which will be bringing it up as far as our knee. But generally speaking, the barbell slows down as it approaches the hip. And obviously, it has to slow down because it's coming to a full stop. Now, if we contrast that with the kettlebell swing, as we go through that upward motion, the concentric phase, when we're really driving our hips forward and into the kettlebell, that kettlebell continues to move faster and faster until we fully extend it at the hip, and then it moves up over its own motion. We're usually not really pulling it up with our shoulders. It just moves up under its own momentum. It slows to a stop, and then it comes back down again. So that's a major advantage of a kettlebell swing for an athlete who's looking to be more explosive and more powerful through the hips. Now, there's a second very important part of the kettlebell swing that's often missed out on, and that is the eccentric loading during the deceleration phase. So we've talked about firing that kettlebell up maybe somewhere around eye level. It doesn't really matter. We fire up the kettlebell until it comes to a stop due to gravity. Once that kettlebell stops, then it starts accelerating downward, and our job is to firstly slow down the kettlebell so it doesn't just slam into the floor and we can keep a hold of it. So we have to work hard to eccentrically decelerate that kettlebell, but also what we have to do is we have to eccentrically decelerate it but bring it back into the position where we're going to be doing another swing with it. We're almost never going to be doing 1 rep maxes on a kettlebell. Even when we get very, very heavy, it'll probably be for 3 reps or for 5 reps or somewhere around there. So you have an athlete now who has to have the eccentric abilities, so they have to be able to tighten their muscle while the muscle is lengthening out and be able to stabilize that and bring it back into a good position. Now, this is massively beneficial for somebody like a sprinter who'll have incredibly strong hip extension, but then they'll also have to be able to accept that reactionary force from the ground and maintain good positions throughout. So I think kettlebells have gotten a bit of a bad name in the last probably 5 years when people start looking at, oh, we should just do standard strength training. The kettlebell is really only there for HIIT training or conditioning pieces or things along that line. Heavy kettlebell swings have a very, very good, right and proper place in proper strength training, but it's probably not for the reasons you've been using them.
So next we've got a series of kind of related movements. We've got core and hip flexor specific hip flexor training. Now, hip extension and hip flexion are very nuanced styles of training. They're something you have to specifically go after. So it's not enough just to do your squats or just to do your sprinting. We feel it's very beneficial to have some additional specific work on your core and on your hip flexors in your training. Now, core training is actually pretty easy and it's hard to get core training wrong. most of the time, the barrier for entry for the core is kind of what you prefer doing and what you kind of suck at. You can add weighted movements, you can do leg raises, you can do sit-ups, you can do weighted sit-ups, you can do starfish planks, side planks. Most of these cover this area very, very well, and it's actually hard to kind of get core training wrong, whatever that might mean in the context of S&C. So here we see lots of leg raises, and that seems to be something he's enjoying. On top of this, then we see some single leg work or band resisted hip flexor work. Now, a very common mistake we can make when we're training hip flexors in training is not training full hip extension for those hip flexors and extensors. So we really need to be getting the knee and the foot behind the hip when we're training that. A great way of doing that is with a cable machine in a gym, and if you have an attachment for your ankle, standing in front of that, maybe standing on a plate or a box to give yourself plenty of range of motion, maybe holding on to something else or someone, depending on how you're able to set it up, and bring that leg and foot all the way back behind you and then bring it all the way up. You could in theory do those hanging from a pull-up bar if you wanted, if that was a better way of setting it up, but what we need is a resistance, that leg getting behind and our knee and our foot getting behind our hip into full extension, and then bring that all the way up as high as we can to feel a good contraction. It's very obvious when you get it correctly that hip flexor pump is unlike anything else, especially if you haven't been training them, and it's incredibly important for runners, for sprinters. Lots of athletes could benefit from that, not only probably from a hip health point of view or hip pain point of view, but when we're looking at moving our knees quickly and fluidly through that motion, as having fast knees or fast feet, whatever coaching cue you're getting when you're running, having that option to be able to do that as powerfully as possible and training those hip flexors directly is very, very important. Now, in regards to core training, sprinting, of course, is a full body movement, not to sound like a functional fitness guru, big locomotion, all that shit. But the main thing here is sprinting is heavily involved in the upper body and with the legs, and the conduit between those is the core, and having the capacity to have a rigid core and be able to transfer that power from the upper body. The arm swing, incredibly important for sprinting, as a lot of you sprinters know and runners are very, very aware of, and having the capacity to transfer the power and that movement from the top down to the bottom is very, very important, and having a weak link in the middle is not ideal. So training that core makes perfect sense. There's essentially no negatives to training core. We don't hear of people tearing their abs training core very heavy. It's something that is very quick. You can superset it like that individual muscle, the isolation work that we've seen doing earlier, and get it done pretty quickly. You could spend less than 30 minutes training your core per week in the gym and have a very sufficient level of core training done for your sport.
In the final section then, we have some jumping. Now, we've a few different types of jumps, but this brings up a general question or a general comment we see coming up in sprinters training quite a lot. So when we look at track and field athletes, obviously the use of plyometrics is very, very well bona fide. We know why we do plyometrics. We know why we want athletes jumping, bounding, landing, and doing all that good stuff. Now, typically when we see high-level sprinters doing normal bipedal jumps, and particularly in this case, we see Fred jumping from his knees, landing in a quarter squat position, oftentimes people are underwhelmed by the performance of those jumps because we see other athletes from other sports, maybe that's weightlifting athletes, maybe that's jumping athletes, whether it's triple jumpers, long jumpers, high jumpers, whatever it is, and they will have phenomenal performance in these bipedal non-counter movement jumps. So in this case, we might have athletes from different sports being able to do this with weighted vests. We might see them doing this style of jump going up onto a height. So starting on their knees with very little dip and drive, being able to almost levitate up onto these platforms. Now, sprinters, although they're extremely powerful and extremely explosive, tend not to be the best at this. Their sport really doesn't focus on that large bipedal hip explosion. It's very, very different from somebody like a lightweight class weightlifter who's used to driving off both legs from that squat position and producing a lot of force very, very quickly. Obviously, the mechanics of sprinting tend to be very, very different. So in this case, we see a box jump being done afterwards, and that box jump isn't incredibly high, and oftentimes we'll see people commenting, and that's where we're talking about it, that the height of their box jumps isn't incredibly high, and that's probably what we're seeing here. We're not seeing a direct correlation between those mechanics, between what they're very good at in their sport and what they're exhibiting in the gym. Now, in the final clip here, we see some stage 1 plyometric work. This is a drop jump going to a practice landing position, and this is where the real cream of the crop comes into it for sprint training. This looks to be the most fundamental type of jump training you could do, and it's practicing landing. So this is stage 1 if you're with UKSCA, if you're with the NSCA, whatever it is, wherever you learn your S&C, this is how you will start teaching, or it's how you will introduce an athlete to plyometrics. They will be either jumping from ground height, jumping forward or jumping straight up, and practicing landing mechanics. The next stage then is what we see here, and it is stepping off a plyometric box and landing in that good landing mechanics with stable ankle, knees, hips and upper body positions. This is as important as it gets for a sprinter. Being able to put their foot on the ground in the correct place, accept all of those reactionary forces, and then produce the maximum amount of force afterwards. So when we see sprinters training, this is the real important stuff. This is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And if you are a sprinter, or maybe you're a track athlete, or maybe you're a field sports athlete, and you're looking to bring in that kind of plyometric style of training, or maybe you've been told you need to be faster, you've been told you need to be more agile, this is where your starting point is, and this will probably stay in your training for the duration of your career. Just because we move on to go from here to some counter movement jumps, or maybe we move from that drop jump to a drop jump where you're exploding upwards as quickly and as aggressively as you possibly can, you will still be practicing these landing mechanics for the rest of your training career in most of your S&C sessions. So it is very important to note, we see some weighted jumps here afterwards, some weighted single leg jumps being done very, very well with very nice mechanics. But you can never forget about that foundational work, that real drilling and that work on the body to accept those reactionary forces from the ground is the number one thing for all of your plyo work.
Thanks for watching today's episode of Sika Strength Coaches React, S&C Coaches React. So check out the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. Maybe you're a sprinter, you might be in an off-season, depending on where you are. You might run the off-season athlete program, so there's dynamic loading adjustment, CoachBot to answer all your questions, getting updated all the time. There's a video library, and of course you can contact us and access the Facebook group for weekly live streams and feedback on your questions, where me and Dara and I even, every week we do a live stream where we answer those questions. It's us talking about that and answering your specific questions, so you're not left alone if you have issues. So check that out. A link below to the Sika Strength app. Lots of people getting fantastic results. And hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you do have any specific recommendations on someone you want to see, please do leave them in the comments. And better still, if they have lots of S&C work, or at least some S&C work somewhere, where it's on YouTube or on their social media, so we can get talking about it. So sometimes athletes don't really care about putting their stuff up. A lot of the best athletes often don't put it up, which is a crying shame from our point of view and your point of view. But if you do know someone in your chosen sport, lots of people are asking for swimmers, and we got the swimmers done last week with Caleb Dressel, so we do listen and read the comments. So if you have a recommendation, doesn't matter what sport it is, do leave it and we will take a look at them. So thanks for leaving all those recommendations.